Hey everyone, it's Mostly Casual Commander. I'm BK. We're on Patreon and Discord. Links are in the description. Scott won the die roll and he's playing Ghyrson Starn, Keller Morph. He's looking to ping his opponents to death, and he'll ping better because of Ghyrson. Chris is playing Jodah, the Unifier, with a deck full of legendary creatures, looking to take advantage of Jodah's Cascade effect and Anthem. Matt is playing Lathril, Blade of the Elves, looking to overwhelm his opponents with a bunch of elves or pivot into a life drain strategy. And Kyle is playing Isshin, Two Heavens is One. He'll get additional effects for combat triggers, and he'll attempt to go to combat more than once per turn. And before we begin today's game, we'd like to give a huge shout out to our latest patron, Y2A Elkus. Thank you so much for supporting us over on Patreon. Your contribution goes a long way in helping us continue our content. Now, other people might be jealous of Y2A Elkus, but you don't have to. You can support us on Patreon for as little as $1 a month. You'll gain access to private Discord chats with the crew and more. Also, stick around for an appearance from my fat cat Meatball. He's so chunky. Scott kicked us off by playing a Scalding Tarn and cracking that to go find a Steam Vents, which he'll have enter the battlefield untapped at the cost of 2 life, dropping him to 37. And with that on the battlefield, he'll cast Kumano Faces Kakazan, pronounced flawlessly. So this can ping his opponents, get a +1/+1 counter on a thing, and flip into a 2/2. So with its first lower counter, he'll ping each one of his opponents 1 point of life. He passes the turn over to Chris, who plays a tapped Rogran Triome, the beautiful showcase artwork. No big deal. On Matt's turn, he drops a Forest, and he casts Elves of Deep Shadow, giving him some early Monodork ramp action, or Ramshin, as I like to call it. On Kyle's turn, he plays Vault of Champions, and with nothing to do with the manas, he passes back to Scott. He'll draw and add a second lower counter to his Saga, and drops a command tower before casting Thermo Alchemist. Thanks to his Saga, he'll get a +1/+1 counter on that bad boy, making it a 1/4. Can you believe it? He passes the turn back over to Chris, who plays Ketria Triome, another showcase art. Quite frankly, I think I'm jealous. On Matt's turn, he plays a Swamp as his land for turn, and then casts Fauna Shaman. So now he can start pitching creatures to his bin to go find a creature. He passes the turn to Kyle, who plays Inspiring Vantage, and with that out, he'll cast Rakdos Signet, before passing the turn back over to Scott. So on Scott's turn 3, he'll draw and then uptick his Saga, which will exile it, and then have it enter the battlefield as its flip side, Etchings of Kumano, a 2/2 with haste that can hopefully exile some of his opponent's creatures. He plays Academy Ruins as his land for turn before casting his commander, Ghyrson Starn, Keller Morph. So now all of his pingy dudes in the deck will ping for more. He moves to combat at Kyle with his Etchings of Kumana. He takes 2, and then he passes the turn over to Chris. He'll draw and then play Nature's Lore, finding a forest card and putting it onto the battlefield. So he'll go seek that out and drop Zagoth Triome, a third showcase artwork Triome. What? Then as his land for turn, he'll play Blood Crypt, entering the battlefield tapped. He passes the turn over to Matt, who plays another forest as his land, before casting his commander, Lathril, Blade of the Elves. So this menacing elf can make more elves. He passes the turn to Kyle, who plays a Swamp as his land for turn, and then casts Mangara, the Diplomat, hoping to draw extra cards when he's attacked, or when people cast too many spells. On his end step, Scott activates his Thermo Alchemist, pinging each one of his opponents for 1, but Ghyrson's replacement effect will have everybody take 3. And on Scott's turn, he'll draw, and then he'll cast Roiling Vortex. So at the beginning of each player's upkeep, that player will take 1, and if somebody like Chris, I don't know, cascades, he'll take a lot more damage. Scott then activates Thermo Alchemist, pinging everybody for 3 points before casting Winds of Change. This will trigger Thermo Alchemist, untapping it, and also drawing a card for Kyle thanks to Mangara, the Diplomat, and Winds of Change being Scott's second spell that turn. So each player will shuffle their hands into their library, and then they'll draw that many cards again. Following that play, Scott will pass the turn over to Chris, and on his upkeep, Roiling Vortex triggers, pinging Chris 3 damage. He plays an island as his land for turn before casting his commander, Jodah, the Unifier. Chris will take aim at casting some legendary creatures to cascade into other legendary creatures. He passes the turn to Matt, who takes 3 on his upkeep, plays a forest, and then casts Elvish Mystic. Following that, he activates his Fauna Shaman. He discards a creature card and goes and searches his library, revealing a Ruthless Winnower and putting it into his hand. Following that, he moves to combat, attacking Chris with Lathril. Thanks to Menace, Chris can't block, so Matt will create 2 elf tokens. He then passes the turn to Kyle, and on his upkeep, he'll take 3 more damage. He also plays a mountain as his land for turn before casting Unexpected Windfall. Kyle momentarily mistaps, but he corrects that in just a second. So he'll discard a card, draw 2 cards, and make 2 treasure tokens. Then, as a follow-up play, Kyle casts Hanweir Ghyrson. When this thing attacks, he can make some 1/1s, and hopefully he'll get more because of Isshin if he gets out onto the battlefield. On Kyle's end step, Scott activates Thermo Alchemist again. He'll deal 3 damage to each of his opponents, and then on his turn, Roiling Vortex will ping him for 1, also replaced by Ghyrson, dealing him 3. He then casts a fancy Rhystic Study before passing the turn to Chris, who on his upkeep takes 3 damage, draws and plays the World Tree, entering the battlefield tapped. Then he casts Suruk Dragonclaw. This will grant trample to all of his creatures, which is pretty good. It also triggered Jodah, so he starts cascading. And as he's digging through his cards, he's looking for a 4-drop or less. He'll find Lelia, the Blade Reforged, and cast that without paying its mana cost. So this triggers 3 things. Mangara the Diplomat, Rhystic Study for Scott, as well as Roiling Vortex, dealing 5 damage to Chris. He'll put those exiled cards on the bottom of his library. He then represents Jodah's Anthem effect by placing some dice on there. Each one of them gets +3/+3. He moves to combat at Scott with Jodah, who takes it to his face. Then Chris passes the turn over to Matt, so he'll take 3 damage on his upkeep, draw for turn, and then play another forest as his land. And with the help of Elves of Deep Shadow, he casts Ruthless Winnower. So at the beginning of each player's upkeep, they'll have to start sacrificing non-elf creatures. He passes the turn to Kyle, who takes 3 damage from Roiling Vortex, sacks his Mangara the Diplomat to Ruthless Winnower, then he drops Hanweir Battlements as his land for turn. Yo, that's the thing that melds with Hanweir Ghyrson.
Meld. I don't win, but I win.
Melding that is totally a win.
I don't like this.
What's not to like, Chris? 2 cards become 1 card, and it's a big dude that's gonna make other dudes. So that thing becomes a 7/4 trample with haste that drops 2 3/2s whenever it attacks. Kyle moves to the red zone and makes 2 Eldrazi Horror tokens, and they enter tapped and attacking Scott as well. Scott lines up some blocks, putting his creatures in front of the Eldrazi Horrors to stem some of the bleeding. Scott takes his beats, and the 2 of them will clean up their boards.
Fun fact, both horrors die, because this is a 1/4, so it deals 1 damage, and Ghyrson deals an extra 2 to it.
Kyle ends his turn, and on his end step, Scott activates his Thermo Alchemist again. That boy's doing work. On Scott's upkeep, he decides to respond to Ruthless Winnower's triggered ability, so he'll activate Thermo Alchemist again, dealing 3 points of damage to his opponents. Holding priority, he casts Needle Drop, targeting Matt. So he will untap Thermo Alchemist, draw a card, and then deal 3 more points of damage. And after that, he will then activate his Thermo Alchemist yet again, dealing 3 more damage to everybody. Man, who would have thought? Ghyrson and Thermo Alchemist working so well together. Scott casts Abrade, again triggering Thermo Alchemist's ability, untapping it, and killing Matt's Lathril, sending it back to the command zone. And finally, he activates Thermo Alchemist yet again, dealing 3 more damage to everybody before Ruthless Winnower's ability resolves. Scott sacrifices his MVP before resolving his Roiling Vortex, dealing 3 points of damage to himself, and finally drawing for turn. What an upkeep. Then he plays Urza's Saga as his land for turn, and with nothing else to do, he passes over to Chris, who sacrifices Lelia with Ruthless Winnower's ability, takes 3 damage, going to 2 points of life. He'll draw for turn, play a forest as his land, and then moves into combat, attempting to punish Scott as much as possible before probably dying. Scott decides to chump block Jodah with Ghyrson, attempting to block as much damage as possible. Thanks to Suruk, they both have trample damage, and Scott drops to a uncomfortable 3 before Chris casts Sky Shroud Claim. So Chris gets his ramp on before passing the turn back over to Matt. On his upkeep, Matt takes 1 and does not have to sack a creature because they're all elves. Ruthless Winnower's like, you're good, dog. He casts Elvish Promenade, making 6 more elf tokens.
He needs to hit.
Can I have a die? Or, yeah. That's fine.
That many.
I don't need that many.
I don't know how many needed.
So Matt creates his 6 elf tokens before moving into the red zone, lining up some attacks at each one of his opponents. And this will have Kyle drop to 4, Scott drop to 1 point of life, and unfortunate for Chris, knock him out of the game. Sorry, Chris. Matt passes the turn, and on Kyle's upkeep, Ruthless Winnower will make him have to sacrifice Hanweir the Writhing Township, unfortunately. I'll also deal him 1 point of damage because of Roiling Vortex. He'll draw, play a Smoldering Marsh as land for turn, and finds the perfect answer for the situation in Aurelia the War Leader. This hasty vigilancy threat attacks Matt, dealing 3 damage, and grants him a second combat step after the fact, attacking Matt again for 3 damage, which drops him to 0, knocking him out of the game. Right in the nick of time, too, I'd say. Following that, Kyle passes the turn back to Scott.
I'm gonna
I also
untap,
have yet to buy
and
some.
on my upkeep, I'm going to take 1 to my Roiling Vortex and die.
Nope.
And that makes Kyle the winner. Congratulations, bud. And here's Meatball. And there you have it. That's the game. A narrow victory for Kyle, but a victory nevertheless. And I feel Scott's pain. I once died to my own Phyrexian arena. So let us know what you thought about the game in the comments. Thank you again to our latest Patreon, Y2A Alcus. And as always, thank you for watching.